Eddie Van Halen didn't just play the guitar, he changed what people believed the instrument could do. To millions of fans, he was a smiling magician of rock, a man whose fingers seemed to bend physics itself. His solos weren't just technical displays, they were explosions of energy, joy, and invention. Yet behind that infectious grin and revolutionary sound lived a far more complicated reality. Eddie's journey wasn't only about admiration and success, it was also shaped by rivalry, disappointment, and moments of quiet resentment towards some of the very guitarists he once idolized. These tensions weren't always loud or public. In many cases, they simmered beneath the surface, hidden behind polite interviews and professional courtesy. But they were real. Some of rock's most legendary guitarists, players Eddie studied obsessively as a teenager, eventually became figures he struggled to understand, compete with, or even respect. What caused these fractures between giants? Why did admiration sometimes turn into distance, or even bitterness? To understand Eddie Van Halen fully, you have to look at these relationships, the heroes, the rivals, and the complicated emotions in between. One of the earliest and most emotionally complex figures in Eddie's life was Eric Clapton. Long before Van Halen became a household name, Eddie was just a kid in Pasadena, sitting on the edge of his bed with a cheap guitar and a stack of records. Among them, Clapton's work with Cream stood above the rest. Night after night, Eddie would drop the needle onto Crossroads, listening carefully, trying to decode every bend, every vibrato, every subtle nuance of Clapton's playing. Clapton wasn't just an influence, he was the reason Eddie picked up the guitar in the first place. Eddie would later admit that he spent countless hours trying to play those solos note for note, chasing something he couldn't quite define but deeply felt. It wasn't about fame or recognition back then. It was about understanding. What made Clapton's playing feel alive? Why did it move people the way it did? Those questions shaped Eddie's musical identity. But time has a way of changing perspectives. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had done something extraordinary. He hadn't just joined the conversation, he had completely rewritten it. When Eruption hit the world, it didn't sound like anything that had come before. His two-handed tapping, dive bombs, and harmonic squeals created a sonic language that felt almost alien. Suddenly, the kid who once studied Clapton was now the one redefining the instrument. Yet not everyone embraced this new direction. When Clapton was asked about Eddie's playing, his response, casual as it may have seemed, cut deeply. He acknowledged Eddie's technical ability, but questioned the emotional depth, suggesting there wasn't much soul in his playing. For Eddie, that comment wasn't just criticism, it was heartbreak. The man who had inspired him, who had unknowingly guided his entire musical path, didn't connect with what he had become. Eddie never lashed out publicly. That wasn't his style. But privately, the disappointment lingered. It forced him to confront something difficult, the idea that even your heroes might not understand you. Their philosophies were simply different. Clapton came from a world rooted in blues tradition, where restraint and phrasing carried emotional weight. Eddie, on the other hand, represented freedom, experimentation without boundaries, sound pushed to its limits. In a way, they symbolized two different eras of guitar playing. Clapton was a voice of the past, steeped in tradition. Eddie was a sound of the future, unpredictable and explosive. Over time, Eddie came to accept that difference. His admiration didn't disappear, it evolved. He still spoke reverently about Clapton's tone and feel, recognizing that what he had learned in those early years would always remain part of him. If Clapton represented emotional disappointment, Ritchie Blackmore represented something colder, distance. As a teenager, Eddie had idolized Blackmore's work with Deep Purple. Songs like Highway Star and Burn were masterclasses in precision and power. Eddie would study them relentlessly, fascinated by the dramatic phrasing and sharp tone that defined Blackmore's style. So when Eddie finally found himself sharing the same professional world as his heroes, he hoped for connection. Instead, he encountered indifference. When he met Blackmore, there was no warmth, no acknowledgement, just a cold stare. For someone as open and enthusiastic as Eddie, that moment was crushing. He wasn't looking for praise, just a simple human interaction. But it never came. That experience stayed with him. He later described how certain guitarists, Blackmore among them, seemed unwilling to engage, as if threatened by the new generation. And in many ways, that interpretation wasn't far off. Eddie's arrival had disrupted the established order. His playing demanded attention, and it forced other musicians to reconsider their own approaches. Blackmore's eventual comments about Eddie reflected this divide. He acknowledged Eddie's skill but criticized him for playing too many notes, a subtle but clear philosophical disagreement. For Blackmore, music was about control and intention. For Eddie, it was about expression and exploration. Neither was wrong. They were simply speaking different musical languages. A similar tension emerged with Joe Perry. During Van Halen's early touring years, Eddie often found himself in the presence of musicians he had once admired. But instead of camaraderie, he encountered what felt like silent rejection. Perry, like others, kept his distance. No conversation, no acknowledgement, just that same unspoken barrier. For Eddie, those moments were confusing. He had grown up respecting these players, studying their work, drawing inspiration from them. Now, standing on the same stage, he expected at least a gesture of mutual respect. Instead, he felt like an outsider. But rather than letting it discourage him, it fueled his determination. If the old guard wouldn't accept him, he would carve his own path. And that's exactly what he did. Eddie's focus was never on approval, it was on creation. He played because he loved it, because it brought him joy. Over time, even those who had initially kept their distance began to recognize his impact. Joe Perry himself would later openly praise Eddie, acknowledging that he had reinvented guitar playing in a way no one else had. If those tensions were rooted in generational shifts, Eddie's clash with Tom Scholz was more about philosophy. Scholz, the mastermind behind Boston, approached music with scientific precision. An MIT-trained engineer, he built his own equipment and crafted his sound with meticulous care. Eddie, by contrast, operated on instinct. His approach was raw, intuitive, and driven by feel. When the two shared a stage, their differences became apparent. Eddie later recalled an incident where Scholz appeared to replicate parts of his solo. Whether it was homage or coincidence, Eddie didn't see it that way. To him, it felt like imitation without acknowledgement, a violation of something deeply personal. Originality was everything to Eddie. He had spent years experimenting, building his own guitars, modifying amps, chasing a sound that was uniquely his. Seeing someone else mirror that work, especially without connection or communication, struck a nerve. It wasn't about ego, it was about identity. That theme became even more intense in his confrontation with Rick Derringer. Unlike the others, this wasn't subtle. Derringer, a respected veteran, began incorporating Eddie's style, and even his melodies, into live performances. For Eddie, that crossed a line. Inspiration was one thing. Direct replication was another. He confronted Derringer directly, expressing both admiration and frustration. But when it continued, Eddie took action, removing him from the tour. It was a rare moment of firmness from someone who usually avoided conflict. But it revealed something important. Eddie wasn't just protecting his reputation, he was protecting the integrity of his art. Finally, there was Randy Rhoads. This relationship was perhaps the most complex of all. Unlike the others, it wasn't built on rejection or imitation, it was built on comparison. Both were young, brilliant, and redefining the guitar at the same time. Naturally, the music world couldn't stop comparing them. Eddie's comments about Rhoads reflected a mix of admiration and defensiveness. He acknowledged Randy's talent but emphasized his own influence, drawing a line between inspiration and originality. It wasn't hostility, it was competition, the kind that arises when two artists are pushing boundaries in parallel. Rhoads, for his part, had his own identity, rooted in classical training and disciplined technique. Where Eddie was wild and instinctive, Randy was precise and structured. Together, they represented two sides of the same evolution in guitar playing. Tragically, Rhoads' life was cut short before that dynamic could fully evolve. His death froze the rivalry in time, leaving questions unanswered. For Eddie, it likely added a layer of reflection. Over time, his tone softened. The sharp edges of competition gave way to quiet respect. In the end, these relationships reveal something essential about Eddie Van Halen. He wasn't just a revolutionary musician, he was deeply human. He admired, he competed, he felt hurt, and he grew. The same passion that drove him to innovate also made him sensitive to how his work was received and reflected by others. Perhaps the truth is that Eddie didn't truly hate these guitarists. What he experienced was something more nuanced, a mixture of admiration, misunderstanding, rivalry, and the inevitable tension that comes when great artists occupy the same space. In many cases, the conflict wasn't about dislike at all. It was about identity, legacy, and the struggle to be original in a world that's always listening. And through it all, Eddie kept playing, chasing that sound he first heard as a teenager, sitting alone in his room, trying to understand what made the guitar come alive.